As an introduction to InDesign, the first thing we're going to do is get a document open so that we can see all of the tools and really first get to know a little bit of the interface that we're working with, looking at both the interface and how to navigate it. So once you've opened InDesign, this will likely be the first screen you see, depending on the version you have. Sometimes the version will go right to the tools, right to the program interface, and you have to go to File and New to create a new document. Now they give a little bit of a different setup, and in some of the versions you may see templates. In some you may see recent documents, depending on how things are set up and how you have your own workspace set up. In any case, you want to do a new document. And what we're going to do is set up our new document as an 8.5 by 11. This is in keeping with our first exercise as well. So we'll go to Create New. And this already looks a little intimidating, but one thing to keep in mind is that we're typically doing in InDesign, we're working with print. And although you can do web, mobile, you can do interactive documents and so on, our focus is obviously going to be on the print portions of InDesign. Now first we're seeing a lot of templates, and you may be seeing numbers here that are unfamiliar. The 51P0, 66P0. What that's referring to is over here, and that's picas. And picas are a unit of measure in design, in print design typically, and we're not going to have to focus very much on picas. We don't really even need to know what they are. We're going to switch the units right to inches, and you'll see in our preset panel here everything changes accordingly to inches. And although the templates don't, that's okay. If we were to click on, for example, tabloid, it would come up in here again, and we would have to do the inches. So that's fine. You know, if you need tabloid is 11 by 17. But then we see all these saying custom. So that's not very helpful to us unless we go right up to print. And then we start to see things a little differently, where in our templates, we can see letter, legal tabloid, and letter half. Letter itself is that 51 by 66 picas. And we're going to use that. We're going to use letter, but we want to go over to our preset panel and do a little more of a manual setup ourselves, just to understand what's going on. So we'll change units to inches again. And in our preferences, our program preferences, we can set that to start at inches. We may do that later here. You may want to do it yourself, but just going into the preferences, and it's not going to let me at the moment, but you would go into the preferences and go to units and increments, and that's where you can set inches. I typically don't do that myself because I work in a few various aspects of InDesign where I want to have a little more manual control, but that's where you can go into your preferences and set that. And if we don't get to it, just let me know if you have any questions in that regard. So letter being 8.5 inches by 11 inches, and we're going to do the orientation at portrait. So that's obviously taller than it is wide. And we're only doing a single page. We're just doing, for this exercise, we're doing a single page sort of newsletter layout. So we're going to do two things, keeping pages set to 1, and we're going to turn off facing pages. Now going forward throughout our class, facing pages will actually become quite important and very necessary quite soon in our classes. However, for this, being a single page, we're going to turn that off. And we'll talk about what facing pages are in more detail when we get to it. Start page 1, we can leave that, and we can leave primary text frame off. Anything that we don't need to really be discussing right now. I'm not going to focus too much on just to, at the risk of overwhelming you with unnecessary information. Columns, we'll leave that as 1. Column gutter, that is a default, and the column gutter is the space between columns. Since we only have 1 column, we don't have to worry about the gutter anyway, but that default is typically quite good unless we're doing some very detailed, more custom work. And then margins, we're going to leave those at 0.5. So 0.5 is a standard for margins, and the margins are not confining like a Word document. The margins are more of a guide and an aspect of safety from helping us, safety in the standpoint of helping us to keep content from being too close to the edge of our page. And it, as new users and new designers, this is something that can be very helpful. Eventually, you may just keep them on, but know that they're not confining and you can work around them as you wish, but they are helpful when you're beginning. We're going to go down to bleed and slug. Now we'll talk about bleed in class a little more. However, we're going to set the bleed here. So a very brief description of bleed is when items, and you can see here the little note that comes up, items that you want to go to the page edge, such as images or color blocks, we want those to do what's called bleeding off. And that's part of the printing process. Like I said, we'll talk about that in more detail in class. However, we want to set what's called the bleed guide so that we know where to take these items to when they go off the page. And it's very important, again, if we want something to go to the page edge, once it's printed and trimmed, that item has to be bled off of the page. And that's in order for, through the printing and trimming process, in order to avoid any missed cuts that will leave a white edge or a very thin white line where we actually wanted something to bleed right off the page. Sounds a little more confusing than it is, but we're going to set that at 0.125, and that is 1 click up of any of these switches, as long as you have the link set. And when the link is set, it will change all of them consistently and uniformly. And although you may often hear just it's 1 click up in the bleed settings, 0.125 is actually 1/8 of an inch, and that is standard bleed. So 1/8 of an inch being standard bleed, and that's typically what you would use in any print document. So just quick review, we have an 8.5 by 11, and the units are set to inches so that we can see the 8.5 by 11, but also this will activate our rulers should we use them, and they'll be in inches. And the orientation is portrait. We have 1 page, therefore we have facing pages turned off, and our start page is set to 1, which is fine. We don't typically have to worry about this. And we don't have a primary text frame, meaning the page isn't going to come up with a text frame already on it. Columns 1, column gutter left to default. These you'll be able to leave alone as well. Margins by default will go to 1/2 inch, and you can leave those. And then we set our bleed from 0 to 0.125 on all sides. And our slug, we're not going to worry about slug. I'm not even going to explain slug to you right now. You can leave that right at 0. Now, one great thing about InDesign is the preview. When you have the option for preview, it's great to use it. And what it's showing us is what's going to happen when we click create or we say OK. So you can see when I clicked preview, took a couple seconds, but it's showing me the page that I'm creating. Now this is kind of like exactly what it says, a preview. If I just close, this will go away. But when I say create, this is what it's going to look like. Okay, so we'll say create. And now things look exponentially more intimidating if you've never been in InDesign before, but that's okay. Remember, we use only one tool at a time of all of these, and very much of what you see as you work through this program, you may not ever use. Even I would say maybe on the regular, 50% of what InDesign is capable of doing and offers us. So please don't be intimidated at this point. We'll be working through this together. So we've got our document set up. This is what we're going to be using for the exercise and the tutorial. And the first thing we want to do is save. So I'm just going to save mine as a demo. And you'll want to save yours titled Exercise 1 and have your name on it. And when you're saving in format, you're going to want to choose InDesign 2020 document. It will default there. Explaining the others, you can create a template. You can use this document as a template, but we don't need to do that. And InDesign CS4 or later IDML, that stands for InDesign Markup Language, meaning that if you were working with other versions or you had to send this to another user that's using a lower version, you can save it as an IDML and it would adapt to that lower version. Although it doesn't always work that well. Sometimes you can open it, you can view the document and move a few things, but there's other aspects that from later versions don't carry over. So it's a cautionary one to use. However, we'll see another aspect of IDML in what's called packaging later. And right now, we're just going to keep it at the default of InDesign 2020 document. And the INDD stands for InDesign document. Okay, and we can save.